actions. Focus on the right COVID care, focus on mental health issues, and get experts to participate on very medium platforms and understand what the experts are saying. Choose the right experts. So it's in view of this whole kind of space. How do we sustain that momentum, and how do we take this space comms journey in the health sector forward? So that's really the context. Parul, over to you.
Thank you so much. Just a heads up to the audience and the speakers. So we are live now on YouTube. I'm just putting the link in the chat box if you would like to share with your friends and colleagues. And also we are being recorded now. So just a heads up for that. We will not be live for the Q&A, but we are live otherwise. Just a heads up on that. So, so thank you so much for your views, Nitin. I'd first like to go to the panel for opening comments, and then we'll carry on the discussion from there. So first, Seema, I'd like to ask you, the one thing do you think that has the one communication trend which we need to look at post the exponential rise in R&D, post-COVID rise in R&D? And not only there's a rise, never has attention been on R&D as before. So what do you think would be the one communication trend which is emerging from that situation?
Yeah, so one very prominent trend that I have seen is that people are now willing to invest in understanding science. I mean, there was a time, and I remember, people would just avoid getting into the details. But today, if you see the common man, the way they have followed through the entire vaccine development cycle that has happened, and the way people have started investing time in understanding the science behind what is happening, is something which is absolutely unprecedented, just as the pandemic was. So I think that general public awareness and involvement and engagement in understanding what's happening around them and developing a better understanding is something which wasn't really seen before, and which also means that this means for the communication community basically then has to be very, very mindful that whatever you are communicating, it has to be authentic, it has to be correct, and not only that, it has to be aligned with the changing dynamics on a day-to-day basis, because what we saw was during this unprecedented pandemic was that things were evolving on a daily basis. So what stood correct and true on day 10 may not be correct on day 20. So in such ever-evolving science and ever-evolving dynamics, how do you really ensure that whatever you are communicating is correct, it's authentic, is something that created new environment for the communication community, which I think most of the people have really taken to very well. And related to this, I would like to say what I saw was that the various organizations like WHO or CDC and the MO, the Minister of Health and Family Welfare, and these institutions also really took to the responsibility of communicating more proactively and on a more regular basis to keep people aware. The general public awareness was very high. That was the most important trend that I noticed.
Thank you, Seema, and I'll come back to you for more discussion on this. I'd like to take the discussion over to Melissa and then to Sharad on two specific points, and then we'll come to Nitin, of course. Melissa, based on what Seema has just said about the evolving nature of research and whether now post-COVID that's the essential nature of research, given the two hats that you wear, especially with the Indian Society for Clinical Research, what do you think needs to be done to address education for the external stakeholders like the media, to make them understand? Of course, it's not something you can solve overnight, but the desire of a journalist to conclude the story in a headline and the mismatch with how research evolves, how do you think that can be addressed? You're on mute. You're on mute.
Sorry, I think you've touched on a very, very important and critical point. And that we need to address going forward, Parul, because I do believe that there has been a lot that has evolved from the pandemic that we need to take lessons from. I mean, just in terms of, what you said, research is a long, slow, long drawn out process. It has a lot of protocol processes, there's regulations on what you can say and what you cannot say. And how do you balance it with the need of the media to have information now. And I think we saw some of those challenges during the pandemic. But also importantly, I think what came through, and the media themselves have admitted it, so this is not news to anyone, we've never had a culture of science journalism in the country. It's, we've had few science journalists and that's about it. So I think we've all learned through this process that, we need to lead with science, we need to lead with data, we need to lead with facts. But it's equally important that we create a body of knowledge that everyone can tap into. And I think if you go back to what was happening during the initial stages of, the pandemic, people were grappling for information. They did not know, where to source information from, who were really the credible people that they should be tapping into. And, the media themselves said there was so much of science and, how does one decide whose science is more credible? So I really think, and this is really an appeal to all PR agencies, because I know organizations have conflicts of interest in doing this, but I think it would be great if we could set up a body really of opinion leaders, who can provide information, guide people, correct misinformation, and be able to provide perspectives and context around developments. Like Seema said, what happened yesterday is not true today. What happens today is not true tomorrow. It's a very dynamic industry. And I think everybody needs context. And what we were missing is really very strong narratives around science during this period. So I think creating a council of trusted and credible medical and science spokespersons for R&D is extremely important.
Thank you, Melissa. That gives me a perfect intro into Sharad. Sharad, when we were discussing these issues before, ahead of the panel discussion today, what are your views on how the whole debate for science issues has opened up, and how do you think that's an unprecedented opportunity for communicators?
So I'm going to do two things. I was waiting for this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change my backdrop. And I thought this would perhaps be even more opportune and more relevant if you can see what's behind me.
Absolutely.
This is something that we actually started when the pandemic first broke out, and a bunch of pharma companies came together, and Pfizer did as well. And very early on, we said, we've got to have that faith in science, and science is what's going to win. And we've kept this line behind us ever since, and it's kind of proven to be true. To your question, and I really reflect also on what Melissa was saying and also what Seema was saying, I think a few things have fundamentally changed. I think, first of all, the familiarity with science, the appetite for science has gone through the roof. I mean, whoever knew words like, PCR tests and antigens and antibodies and viral load and the serum positivity, and today people do. It's incredible. People have got involved in this communication so much over these last 1.5 to 2 years that, to me, it provides the most perfect platform for all of us to build on this and make sure that this interest, this comprehension of what science is, it should not go waste. I see today reporters who would have never thought about writing on medical science are today writing on medical science. I mean, you've got finance reporters, corporate reporters, journalists who used to only cover certain kind of beats, now talking about COVID and, immunization and coverage and seropositivity and how, we could be delivered from the economic slump and all of that. So I think it's really spread far and wide, and that's terrific. To me, the other amazing thing that's happened is, what all of us health communicators have been talking about, and especially people who've been engaging with the government, is this whole health seeking behavior. I think that is now so prevalent. Today, you have people who are aware of public health. They are aware of communicable diseases. They are aware of things like vaccination and immunization. So overall, this whole health-seeking behavior that I am aware, I do require good healthcare. I know what kind of interventions actually work. That again has provided us with a wonderful platform to build on this and make sure that what we've all been yearning for, we have it now. How do we build on this momentum and make sure that we are, going forward a health-seeking, health-getting, health-focused community and society. I think these are two very fundamental changes.
Thank you so much, Sharad. I think you just called it out. It's a health-seeking behavior. Is no longer, people are, they're still doing that, but they're not asking their neighborhood doctor to, or a family member who's a doctor, just tell me on the phone what medicine to take, and I'll do it that way, which is a huge issue in India. With that, I'd of course come back to all of you for more questions, but just a heads up, we are live on YouTube, and I've shared the link in the chat box. If you would like to share it with anybody, please go ahead. Nitin, just like to get your perspective on this whole health-seeking behavior aspect of it. That requires communication at all levels: strategic, micro, digital, peer-to-peer, so many aspects of it. Would you be able to call out for us how do you see that aspect of communication campaigns building in India?
So you're right. I think the whole comm space has really evolved. I think if you take a step back, the whole world changed, right? So while Seema, Melissa, and Sharad talk about how journalists are looking at science and they're getting more interested stuff, I will just take a step back and see the whole geopolitical nature changed of the world, right? We have a new quad as neighbors, right? So one was that. Two, so therefore the communication it did was very different now. Looking at the larger geopolitical situation. Two, it also got into spotlight employee communications, right? So because I think employee communication, internal comms has never been more important ever before. I mean, we've spoken about it, but it's never been more important, and how people have actually, or companies, everybody has actually ensured that they do work with their people and communicate the right messages and the right way. And three is that we've used multiple tools across multiple stakeholder groups, right? So whether it's social or digital, I mean, we all went remote. So, the industry, I think, was absolutely brilliant. We went remote on day one. Most everybody, I think, say 95% of the industry. Whether it's social, digital, whether it's using other tools on social and digital media, whether it's doing public policy work or policy comms work, whether it's looking at purpose-driven campaigns. Purpose has never been more important. I think purpose was gaining importance in 2019, and the pandemic accelerated that whole piece. So if you look at from a larger picture, digital acceleration, the geopolitical environment, public policy, internal communications, and of course tools goes across social media, social and digital, and purpose became very critical.
Thank you so much, Nitin. Before we come back for more questions, I thought I'll just run a small poll to get the audience's point of view as well on what they see as the major issues, since we have such a great audience drawn from the pharma and healthcare sector. So just launching this very quick poll and what you think are the main challenges. This is a confidential poll, so nobody's being identified. Please do share your votes, and I think that will give us a good framework to go back to the panel again for the points of view. So while the poll is running, I'd like to come back to you, Seema, to discuss more on this entire education bit of the media. In reality, in real life, when they're running with deadlines, how do you think that challenge can be handled?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Parul. And we all know that ever since the digital media has taken off, time is a commodity which has even shrunk further, right? So with the kind of timelines that our media friends are chasing, it is virtually impossible for them to spend a lot of time in researching and developing stories. And amidst all that, to find time to be willing to learn is definitely a big challenge. But what I have seen is that this pandemic has actually brought in a very, very huge, mindset shift. So I have seen that, journalists are now actually willing to spend time. And I remember a couple of decades ago when we used to discuss with journalists, it was very difficult for them to come and spend time with you and understand, what you were doing without necessarily wanting to do a story on it. So, but fortunately, I'm seeing that trend is changing. And I think leading healthcare brands possibly need to invest a bit more in having these knowledge share sessions, which, companies like us, we've started doing. We are having, whenever we are doing these webinars, we have started extending invitations to our media journalists and media friends, so that if they are interested in understanding of the science behind what we are doing, we are opening up that platform to them. So that can be one of the ways of doing that. But I think the biggest barrier, which was a mindset, has been addressed already. We are seeing people who are willing to invest and spend time and learn more.
That's a great answer, and it's heartening to know that they are willing to do that. I'll just quickly share the poll results with you. So the majority of you believe that sharing authentic information is the main challenge for science and health communication, and then that's something Seema also touched upon earlier, that whose information is more authentic. That's a challenge. The second biggest challenge is, like, again, which we've discussed, that ensuring education on science communication. How do you do that? That's another challenge. And the third challenge people have believed, though they've rated it last, they've also said that influences people believe in trust. So I think that gives us another dimension to the whole thing of who are the health influencers and the whole celeb influencers on COVID, when they mouth off about vaccines and, tweet weird data on it. So that's another challenge altogether. Melissa, I'd like to come to you first about the influencer bit, and then to Sharad and to Nitin on this issue. We had the American quarterback Aaron Rodgers. He claimed that he was immunized, which and pretended that he was vaccinated. Not pretended, maybe he didn't really pretend, but the implication was that he was vaccinated, and then he developed COVID, and now he's been fined this huge amount. So this whole angle of celebs, and there doesn't seem to be any immediate solution to that. And of course, Trump was the biggest celeb, because he actually said that disinfectant can perhaps kill COVID, and then the company had to put out these that please do not swallow disinfectant. It's not meant for that. So in that context, how do you think these issues can be addressed at all?
So, Parul, before I go to that question, I just want to go back to the question that you asked earlier, and just add that from the Indian Society for Clinical Research, for the last few years, we've been investing in media workshops to take the media right through the whole process of clinical research, what happens, etc. And as things have evolved now with decentralized trials and expedited trials, we've also been addressing that. So that's an important part. And like I said, as Seema mentioned as well, there are more media now reaching out to us just to clarify information, get facts straight, which I think is a good thing. Going back to what you said, honestly, I think my own opinion is on something like this. I think it's extremely important we lead with science. Influencers can endorse what scientists say, but I think what was missing by and large in all of this was that voice of science, if you go back to what happened initially, because that's where the credibility is. An influencer can only endorse something or encourage people, to kind of take vaccine or to say something positive about it, but really we need that data and that information to set the base on which an influencer message is seen as authentic, can be trusted, and all of that. And to me, really, that is the starting point of anything. And it's very unfortunate. Nature magazine recently did a study of I think about 300 scientists and their experience during this whole pandemic, and so many of them, 1 in 6 said they had received death threats. I think about 60% said that they had received attacks on their credibility. There was emotional, psychological distress. There was reputational damage. So you see what's happening to scientists themselves. The moment that they speak up, they're being quelled. And I think there's a challenge and a dangerous precedent that's happening, because those scientists who reported higher frequency of trolling and personal attacks also said that they would be less hesitant to speak to the media. So to me, I think in healthcare communication, particularly when you're talking of something as serious as this, it is very important that we first build those scientific voices of credibility and influence. Bring in others later. And because once you do that, at the moment some other influencer talks about the fact that a vaccine is bad, or they've had the vaccine and it's not turned out to be true, at least you have the scientists who can address those queries. And I think that's important. I mean, I keep saying, I mean, you know, the line we saw earlier, science will win and science has to lead in all of this.
That is actually a very important point that you made. It's science, you lead with science, but I'd like to also take that question over to Sharad. Is it easier said than done, lead with science? You're on mute, Sharad.
Yeah, I was saying, yes, you're absolutely right. It's easier said than done. I'm sure Melissa will bear me out. The job that we have as communicators is so much more important than it has ever been, because we are the bridge between how our scientists would like to communicate. You know, the folks who are in the labs, the folks who are in the research teams, the folks who are, looking at the clinical trial outcomes, for example, they communicate and convey in a certain way, and that is guided by science. You know, scientific communication in its purest form is not about hyperbole. It's not about definitive statements. It's always about precision. It's always about referencing any claim that is made, because that's what's important. That is scientific communication. But on the other side, you do have, the general public to which the media reaches out to, who would want things which are more definitive, which are much easier to understand, which are, 5 words in a sentence. Tell me what the answer is. And that gap is what we guys need to bridge. And sometimes, the temptation is to oversimplify the outcomes of our trial and convey it, from a bottom line perspective. And that's what becomes dangerous. So it's not easy. It is very, very difficult. You've got to maintain the sanctity of scientific communication, and yet you want it to be in a way that the people who are consuming it can really understand what is being shared and what is being disclosed. And I think that's really something that all of us have learned as well during this last year. In our case, with every new development with the vaccine, all the clinical trials, the way that the results were coming out, yes, there is euphoria, but you have to be measured, you have to be specific and precise. And that's what all of us have done. And that's really the journey that we have undertaken. And also the media has undertaken, equally. And I think that really is something very important to do.
If I could just add, Parul, I think what's also important is, while we talk about the communication, the communication of science, I think the science of communication is also important. And that's what that our scientists also need to learn, how to communicate better to the larger lay public as well.
Absolutely. It's and you're right also about the kind of vicious attacks which happened. Dr. Fauci is a case in point. You have people like Robert F. Kennedy, who have not the original one, the new one, who have written an entire book on how he's so motivated, and he's kind of ruined not only the COVID policy but the AIDS policy of the American people. For the American people. So coming to Nitin, to follow up from what Seema, Sharad, and Melissa have said, this whole thing of moving the needle and simplifying the issue without making it seem simple and too simple. How do you address, as the communication expert here, how do you address the channel, and do you see any difference in how the West perhaps has done it and how we are doing it? Any lessons to be shared between the two?
Yeah, sure. So I think the first thing is that, let's take the analogy of what happened to the technology industry a few years ago, right? I think the tech went through the same space. Today, we all kind of know what cloud is, right? I think if you ask people what was cloud 5 years, 3-4 years ago, we didn't want to even understand what cloud is or virtualization is, etc. Right? So I think when the same thing is happening in health, that's why people are more interested in understanding what is the science behind this, what is RT-PCR testing, or what is, etc., etc. What is a viral vector vaccine versus a protein vaccine and all that, right? So, or an RNA vaccine. So I think therefore the inquisitiveness or the need to learn is high, which has happened naturally. To answer your question on how comms can help or do, in three ways really. One is the first thing is how do we simplify communications, right? And when I say simplify, we need to make sure that we are, again, in the health sector, there are different people you're speaking to. So healthcare delivery and services are very different to speak to, and rather than and speaking to customers is very different. So how do we simplify that communications space for the general public? Number one. Number two, and not alarm them at the same time. I think that's the main thing. So while misinformation we have to fight, but not make communication alarming either, right? The second thing is, how do we actually talk to various stakeholders in the whole game, right? So there are preventive health and primary care and foundations, there are healthcare delivery and services, there are pharmaceutical organizations, there are chemists and distributors. So it's a vital role that everybody's playing in. How do we differentiate messaging for everybody, right? So I think I'll stop here. I think the main thing is, how do we simplify messaging in a simple way? It's not easy, understanding cloud is not easy, or in the same way, understanding a vaccine, difference between an RNA vaccine and a viral vector vaccine is not going to be easy either.
I think in India, where there's a lot of suspicion of vaccines and medication across the board, it's even a bigger challenge than, of course, not that the US doesn't have its share of very aggressive anti-vaxxers, but still in India, there are issues of gender and class, which makes access to treatment, equitable access to treatment even more.
I think there is, I don't know what Seema or Sharad think, but I don't think there is, I personally don't think that India has a very big anti-vaxxer community. I think it's about lack of access, like you're saying. There's less access from whether it's gender or a digital divide in terms of the way we are administering a vaccination. So I don't know if we have and so much a big anti-vaxxer lobby, but I think it's more about access and information education, right? I think it's more of that.
That's actually a super point, and it gives us another point on the complexity of the whole communication challenge. And Seema, I'd like to come back to you, and then I'll go to Sharad and Melissa before we ask the audience to share their questions. In fact, if the audience already has some questions, please feel free to share them in the chat box. We are waiting for them. So Seema, my question to you is, the whole, you said that the mindset is shifting and you're trying to brief journalists in knowledge sessions, asking them to come along and listen into the science. Even Melissa said the same. But like we discussed earlier, the journey from lab to people is a long one. So what is your experience on maintaining the interest of the external media, which essentially, the reader of Dainik Bhaskar, Time, Mint, Navbharat, even NewsClick, Lull and Top on YouTube, they are the ones who are actually reaching out to the people. How do you maintain their interest and get their attention away from politics?
That's a very good question. Before I come to this, I just wanted to add to what Nitin had asked, with respect to the vaccine hesitancy. So I think in the first wave of COVID, even India experienced a lot of vaccine hesitancy, because it was too early, the vaccines were coming in, and that was also time when a lot of misinformation was prevalent all over. And I know that we really were facing a lot of challenges in terms of how do you get people to come forward and vaccinate. But as the second wave hit us, and then we went through that, very gruesome experience of lack of oxygen and the mortality rates going up and a lot of people losing life, that is the time when those barriers really came down. And all of a sudden people thought that, okay, let's just respect what the regulators are saying, and they're saying these vaccines are safe for us, let's just go ahead. And then the entire inequity that you spoke about, that all came in because, we did not really have enough vaccines to start vaccination for the entire country. So we had to take a segmentation approach, which then, and we saw that how people in the rural areas were impacted by that. But otherwise, I think the latest milestone that we achieved in terms of 1 billion doses of vaccines which have been given actually point towards that the environment in India is now more conducive and people are willing to trust and take things forward. Now, coming to the question that you asked in terms of how do we really ensure that the media interest stays on in this subject. Now, that's a question that I've been also asking myself for a very long time, because I definitely see this weaning out. And especially the kind of publications that you spoke about, yeah, they are run with the day-to-day action that happens in politics and current affairs, and you forgot Bollywood. But there is hope, given that you saw that so many Bollywood actors also jumped into it, right? They were the ones who became the influencers, even if they did not really know what the science behind this whole thing was. They did take it up on themselves to talk about it. But I think the way to keep this on is to bring their attention to certain diseases which are more mass scale. COVID was an unknown pandemic, but maybe it's time for us to revisit the other infectious diseases like polio or AIDS and all of that. And we need to keep this channel of healthcare communication on. We need to keep their interest alive. And we shouldn't really let this be forgotten once everybody is vaccinated. And so as healthcare communication specialists, we need to have a more sustained communication campaign around various diseases, and especially the communicable diseases, and then move on to the NCDs. Because if you look at the non-communicable diseases like diabetes and cancer and all of that, and we do a lot of work in this area. So what I'm seeing is that there is an increased interest in understanding the science behind these disease areas, and how do you really move towards managing your life better. So it's not always about treatment. It's also about managing your lifestyles and managing your way of handling these diseases. So the interest has to continue, and it has to move on to different therapy segments. That would be my suggestion.
Thank you, Seema. That gives me the perfect segue to Sharath, because we did discuss this and how COVID can be a game changer for opening up communication about NCDs and other challenges. Could you share your views on that?
Yeah. Look, 2 years ago, when you would say vaccination or immunization, the first and only thought that would come in your mind is a visual of a newborn little baby who's been taken by his parents or her parents to the pediatrician to get the routine immunization done. The only time in your mind that you would ever imagine anybody who's not a little child getting a vaccine is if he or she were, let's say, to be bitten by a dog, right? From there to now, you had millions of grown-ups, like all of us on this panel, our parents, elderly, comorbids, who all said, hey, listen, I'm going to roll up my sleeve. I'm going to go to a doctor and I'm going to say, give me a vaccine, right? Not because I've been bitten by a dog, not because something has happened to me and now I need to take a tetanus vaccine, for example, but because I want to prevent a disease. This concept of immunization and vaccination for adults as a tool to prevent disease, that awareness that we have today, it's unprecedented. How do we build on this? To Seema's point, and also to a question that Girish had asked, what are some of the behavioral changes that you witnessed? To me, this is the behavioral change. You've had a large adult population who is now open and aware of a wonderful health intervention called vaccination. You've got an entire delivery ecosystem. I mean, imagine what we have accomplished in a country of our magnitude and our complexity, an entire delivery system that can actually welcome these adults and give them a shot. How do we build on this? Let me give you one example. Pneumonia, and I say this because we are in that space. Here is a disease that affects not just children, but elderly. Every one of us is aware of at least one adult or elderly, in fact, somewhere in our network who has had pneumonia or who has succumbed to pneumonia. It is a vaccine preventable disease. Is this therefore an opportunity for us to say, hey, there is one more respiratory disease. It's a killer. It affects those with comorbidities. It affects those who are elderly above 60 or 70. And it can be prevented by a single shot of a vaccine. So to me, this should not be a wasted opportunity. This change that has happened in the delivery ecosystem, in the attitude, in the awareness, and the policy system, we've got to build on this and we've got to take it forward from here and say, What are these interventions that we can bring? What are the other big healthcare challenges, communicable diseases that can be resolved and solved? And then use this momentum to go and start a programming kind of intervention in that space. I think that is the best way to take this forward.
So we've built an unprecedented ecosystem, which would have never happened in a normal world. So take advantage of that and drive it for the other healthcare issues. The only other comparable thing that I have seen is the DOTS program for TB, where they did with the help of WHO and Global Fund build a very large network of medication. But this is far bigger than that, of course. So coming to Nitin for one last question before we open it up to the audience. Please continue with your question. Keep your questions coming. Nitin, what about the whole ethics of health communication? You know, it seems like it's a no-brainer. But given the complexity of it and given the policy environment in India, what would be your prescription, so to speak, for ensuring ethics in health communication? Though I really believe it's very difficult to ensure ethics at large scale, but still would like your views on that.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think ethics in health we've been speaking about it for many years. I think I'll keep it simple. I think, choosing the right words, not to spread panic or miscommunication on an issue is the first core thing, I think. And we learned that the hard way during COVID, right? As much transparency as possible to different facts. And, we've seen a lot of information around this trial and third trial and second trial data, and not, some companies sharing it in time, some companies not sharing it in time. So transparency to the extent possible, right? And being very simple in their communication. Choosing the right channel of communication, right? So health involves a lot of patients and people. So, check, double check, and always, write prepare as much as you can before you send out the message. And finally, I think the right people who can communicate your message, right? So the KOLs have to be carefully considered and segregated smartly based on issues and conversations in the public domain, right? A wrong spokesperson can make it really difficult. And, so choosing that KOL is going to be very important. And India, of course, like you mentioned, remains a very, heavily regulated market. And in that case, I guess, remaining connected to our allies, engaging with a lot of KOLs and third-party advocates, highlighting, sensitive issues through sector federations or associations rather than directly, and balancing messages with community initiatives. I think that's going to be very I would say that's the prescription from an ethics and regulation perspective.
Thank you, Nitin. And we've really run over time in terms of panel discussion, but I still have a whole list of questions, but I shall hold that back. I'd like to hand over to the audience for any questions they have. Tejaswini, would you like to ask the question yourself? You can unmute yourself if you like and do that, or I can ask it for you.
Yeah, hi everyone. You can hear me, right?
Yes, we can. Hi, go ahead.
Yeah. So my question is basically, you have mentioned it very correctly or rightly that authentic and precision-based information we are giving to the journalist. But actually, when we reach out to the journalist, the media is so diverse. In healthcare also, there are like 4 or 5 sections. Even if you go ahead and tap only the science-based journalists, even if you go ahead and give them all kinds of information with webinars and making them come to your factory and show what is the actual making is, still I have realized this through my experience that not even half of them finish their stories. So what do you think, what could be a reason or where it could be going wrong or something like that?
Who would like to take that up first? Seema, Melissa, perhaps?
Well, so yeah, you're right, Tejaswini. That challenge is always there because, it's human nature. You would move on to the easier things and, you would like to pluck the low-hanging fruits first, and something which is difficult, then you would like to park it aside. So one of the ways to do it is to work with those journalists and see how you can facilitate their story writing. So, though it's a difficult one, but we have tried and it works for us, where you help them and you talk to them and you ask them what the barriers are, what are the challenges, and then you help them in terms of shaping the narrative. And but of course, you have to be willing to be patient and give them more time for these kind of stories.
Melissa, Nitin,
Yeah, I'd just like to add, Parul, that, when I talked about the media workshops, these are done proactively. They're not directed at coverage or anything like that. And we extend it to beyond science journalists. So we call a whole universe of journalists, very basic information. So the whole idea is to really prep them so that they can and we get various stakeholders, to speak. So we get an investigator, we have a clinical researcher, we have other kinds of doctors, ethics committee representatives, etc. So everyone gives their perspectives. Sometimes we've even done role plays in these workshops just to show them what informed consent is like and things like that, to get them to really understand the complexities of all of this so that there is better and more informed reporting. It is tough. It's a process that we continue to engage in, but I think the more we do these kind of things, the more receptive, the more informed even journalists will be. And also show them the end game, because research is honestly a very difficult process to understand. And I think that's important for them to understand that there are certain processes, it follows a certain logical flow, and what really the end point of all of that is.
I think, I'll just add to what Melissa said. I think, it's going to be a slow process. It's not going to be it's not going to happen overnight, right? So it's going to be a slow process. And there is a clear need to humanize science. And that humanizing science will take time, and, it is not going to happen overnight. So it's a slow burn, but we'll get there. And I think it's better than what it was 2 years ago. It's great. It's much better than it was 6 months ago. I mean, just one behavior I've noticed for people is that not many people unmute and keep their unmuted mics on during a panel discussion like this. When we started a year ago, we used to keep telling people, please unmute yourself, please mute yourself. Now people, so, it's all about behavior change, right? So it'll happen. It's a matter of time.
Thank you, Nitin. Sharath, would you have a point of view on this?
2 points that I would make. One, I fundamentally believe that every journalist who's writing on any subject wants to be as authentic, as correct, as informed, as